Well, news today that despite a call from Labor and the Greens for a climate emergency declaration in the Parliament, Australia will in fact meet its Paris targets if it continues its current renewable energy deployment, which has been one of the fastest uptakes of renewables in the world. According to the latest statistics and the report from the Australian National University, Australia has spent 11 times the global average on renewable power, 5 times faster than China, the EU, Japan or the United States. This comes as the New South Wales government is pushing to rule out the dubious use of so-called Scope 3 emissions when it comes to assessing the go-ahead for Australian coal mining projects, saying Australia can't be held to account for the emissions of other countries. Joining me now is Graham Lloyd, Environment Editor for the Australian newspaper, and Liberal MP Craig Kelly. Great to have you on the show, Graham. We always love having you here.
Thanks, Peter.
Explain to me the significance or your takeout of this ANU report out today on where we're tracking in terms of the Paris commitments, but also the current take-up and the trajectory required to stay in the game on renewables.
Okay, very interesting report from ANU, which traditionally has been very supportive of renewables. And in a way, there's something in there for everybody, because it says that the actions that have been taken by Australia have been well in advance of other countries in terms of per capita deployment of renewables. So the government can say, well, look, we have been taking action. This commentary that we're not doing anything is in fact wrong. But the sting in the tail is that to continue any fall in CO2 emissions that will start to kick in the next year or two, there will have to be a continuation and perhaps an acceleration in government support for the renewable energy industry. This really extends to batteries, it extends to the extension of transmission networks and other things. So it's saying that for all the money that's been spent, there is going to soon be a bit of a dividend in terms of reduced emissions, but to keep it up, there has to be a lot more spending.
And did they put a figure on the spending, Graham?
Well, look, impossible to put a finger, but it would be billions of dollars. It's something increases the cost of power depending on how much renewables is in the system. But you're looking at hundreds of millions of dollars in extensions to the interconnect networks. And then if you start to provide subsidies for battery storage in homes and other things, the sums of money add up very, very quickly.
Well, Craig Kelly, Graham's right on the capacity to bed in a renewable energy component to the grid without creating even more vulnerability to an already vulnerable grid, as we know, when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine. But how much money is Australia prepared to spend on renewables when you look at all the other calls on the budget? And can we get to the Paris target levels without billions of dollars?
Well, Peter, you make a very good point. Every dollars we spend on so-called investment, or I'd call it malinvestment on renewables and the infrastructure and transmission, is a dollar we can't spend on health or education or hospitals or our road networks or listing more drugs on the PBS. The money has to come from somewhere. And yes, we've had this big uptake of renewables, but it has come at a very heavy price to Australian industry, Australian small business and Australian consumers. We saw a report out earlier this month by St Vincent de Paul showing there were 395,000 households that had their electricity disconnected over the last 3 years. So this report, firstly, it debunks the myth that Australia is doing nothing. We are doing more than almost any other nation in the world, perhaps other than places like Venezuela that has had the biggest emissions reduction of anywhere, and it's coming at a heavy price.
Graham, where are the rest of the world in relation to both their renewable uptake and also, I guess, their tracking in terms of meeting Paris commitments?
Well, everybody is at various places in that quest to, if you like, meet the Paris agreements. I think this report puts in context the per capita spend from Australia, that it's 11 times greater than the global average, and I think Germany is held up as being an example of, the best practice in investing in renewables. In Australia, for the past few years, has been double them. Australia, if it can continue a trajectory or find another way to reduce emissions from electricity, can meet the Paris commitment for 2030. Other countries are no closer to being able to meet their commitments than Australia. I think the EU has admitted that it's going to miss the targets that are in place. The latest reports out of China is that they're going gangbusters building new fossil fuel power generation. Really, this is, have to be borne in mind that if Australia does achieve the Paris targets, that alone is really not going to do anything to addressing the issue of climate change anyway.
Well, can we underscore that point? 1.3% of global emissions, and we do all this heavy lifting. It means diddly squat. But Craig, isn't this the whole issue? That we have all of these internal debates in this country. We spend literally billions of dollars. We send all of our resource good fortune out the back door to appease the climate change gods in Paris, when even the Europeans, as Graham just said, are not going to meet their own targets, let alone all the other heavy emitters. Craig, that's the real crux of it all. Why are we the mugs?
Well, that's correct. Firstly, you've seen Graham talked about Germany there as the poster child. Germany is currently, their industrial production is in freefall. They're now being described as the sick man of Europe because of the high electricity costs that they put upon their population with trying to meet their Paris targets. But ultimately, it gets down to some type of cost-benefit analysis. Now, Graham says Australia, meeting the Paris targets won't do very much by ourselves, and that's correct. But even, Peter, if every single nation makes their Paris commitments by 2030, the numbers have been done, we save 1/20th of 1 degree by the year 2100. And that's assuming that the computer models, which are running hot at the moment, prove to be correct. So we're doing all this, and if every other nation does all this, the potential saving, highly speculative, is 1/20th of 1 degree.
Graham, I want to move to another issue, Scope 3 emissions. These are emissions that are talked about, measured, relating to exports of Australian resources, in particular, let's say coal, sent offshore and burnt in another country, and those emissions that we potentially have to account for in our own numbers because the coal emanated from us. As I said before, the wine we might grow and the wine we might export overseas, we don't count what that bottle of wine might do to someone who could be an alcoholic or any other harm, but we've got to count the emissions. Just on this point, it was brought in by activist judges, I have to say, or an independent planning association in New South Wales, that these emissions should be counted. It was one of the reasons why a particular mine was knocked back. Is this the push we're going to see out of the official UN bodies and climate bodies, that Scope 3 emissions become a formal part of targets? They're informal now, as I understand, but is this where we're headed?
Well, I think that it's no secret that the global view from activists particularly has been that there should be an orderly and coordinated closing down of the fossil fuel industry. And the way to do that is to make the countries that produce the stuff responsible for the emissions that they produce. And this is the area where Australia is particularly vulnerable. We may have a relatively small domestic market, but we are one of the world's biggest exporters of coal, and imposts in that area will have a great impact on the Australian economy. So in the bigger push to phase out coal in total, which Extinction Rebellion and others, this is their destination, then Australia is in the sights for Scope 3 emissions, and the courts are being asked to indulge them in that campaign.
And just on that point, though, Graham, I mean, is there any rebate or discount factor applied to Australia? Because if you're using our coal as opposed to less cleaner coal out of, say, Mongolia or indeed Indonesia, it's better for the environment. Why is there no sort of concomitant windfall that comes to Australia for doing the right thing, for having cleaner energy sources?
Well, in the land of the angels, you really only focus on the bit that concerns you, and no coal is the outcome. So there won't be any cross-trading there, because if you want to do a proper accounting of it, you'd look at exactly the issues you're raising. And as Angus Taylor, I think, has raised in the part, the global benefit that Australia provides by providing LNG exports as an alternate fuel to coal in other places. But nobody's really doing those calculations. It's being seen as a very blunt approach and a blunt instrument, and Scope 3, I think, is at its crudest.
Yeah, and it's happening via the courts, as you said there, Craig Kelly. It's happening via the courts when the elected officials of the country have not gone down that path, and certainly, as Graham just said, the international bodies haven't gone down that path. How tough is that for ordinary voters who want to say on these issues to find the courts are running their own activist agenda?
Well, Peter, this talk about Scope 3 emissions, I think, is one of the greatest threats to our economic prosperity that I can see. If we are forced to count our coal exports, also our LNG exports, and our iron ore exports also get wrapped up in there with steel production, if they're forced to be counted in our emissions targets, we will send this country bankrupt. And it is just green madness, because countries like China and India, they actually mine more coal than we do here in Australia. And the only reason they import coal from Australia is because our coal is a higher quality, it's a better quality, which burns with lower emissions. So if you penalise Australia, you'll have the complete counter effect of what you're doing. You'll end up more emissions in places like China or India, not less. And not only will you do that, you will bankrupt this economy.
Craig Kelly, as always, thanks for common sense. Thanks for your time tonight. And anyone at home, if you're interested in this issue, you want to follow all the ins and outs, particularly what's happening overseas and all the official dogma that sits behind the UN on a lot of these issues, you cannot miss Graham Lloyd in the Australian newspaper. Graham, thanks very much for your time tonight.
Thanks, Peter.